All right, so this is week 2. And if you guys haven't already said it before, please fill out the attendance form. You guys can see on the screen here. And the link to these PowerPoints is on Slack, so you can follow along on Slack as well. All right, so this is week 2, JavaScript. So last week we did HTML and CSS, and this week is all about JavaScript. And now before we begin about Software Saturdays lesson 2, I did want to address a few things from last week I saw in the feedback form you guys filled out, as well as some questions I saw. A lot of you guys wanted to see if the chat could be fixed so you could see everyone's questions. I should have said it so now everyone can see all questions being sent, so I don't have to, it's not just sent to me. So if someone could send like a message like a hello or like a hi, so we can make sure that everyone sees all participant messages. There should be an option in the chat menu that says send to all participants, and see if you guys can select that one. Okay, I guess it's not working, unfortunately. All right, well, I'll keep trying to figure out what's up with that, but one second, sorry. Yeah, so I'll try to fix that, but yeah, all right then. And also the video audio will be fixed this time. We're recording it separately, so it won't get messed up by WebEx if we're watching the video from last week. And that should be everything that would cover last week. All right, so last week we covered HTML and CSS. So again, if you want, as a quick reminder for everyone, HTML and CSS is like the foundational of web design and web development in general. So you can do all sorts of things in HTML and CSS, like making some pretty cool websites, but these websites are kind of like really boring. They don't really do a whole lot. So what we can do is we can use JavaScript to actually adjust that and make it more dynamic and interactive and all that, so they'll be more interesting for the user and everyone else involved. Okay. So as a review for this semester, we have 7 projects or 7 lessons planned. The first 5 are learning sessions. The last 2 are project sessions. JavaScript is week 2 here, so we have 3 more things to cover. Next week, we'll be covering the ReactJS and the actual stuff that this course covers a lot more in detail. So once we learn about JavaScript, we can move into more, I guess, the more fun stuff. Very few people are writing plain JavaScript nowadays. They're all kind of using some other tools, but we do have to learn it just because it's important to learn this sometime as you do web development. Cool. And as a reminder for everyone, these sessions happen every Saturday at 3:30, and these recorded sessions get posted onto YouTube. Usually I'm going to try to aim for every Sunday, hopefully like midday or so. We'll see if YouTube cooperates with me on that one. And again, I'll email and post a link to those videos to everyone every week. And then we also have review hours. We had our first one this past Thursday from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern Time. If you have questions at all at any point in this course, please come to our review hours, get some individual help from one of our very qualified mentors, or just ask in the Slack channel. The Slack channel Fall 2020 Web Dev is the go-to place to ask any questions about web development, especially in this semester's web development. We also link all the slides and videos there as well, so if you want to look at those, pop on by there and get a quick look. Now, if you haven't already, I mentioned this last week as well, please download a text editor. You will need it for this course just because we edit and modify and make these files. There are a lot of good options. I personally recommend Visual Studio Code. The link to download it is over here. But there are several good ones like Atom, Notepad++, or terminal-based ones like Emacs or Vim if you're kind of advanced. And as always, our demo files for this lesson are always on GitHub. Now, speaking about GitHub, I do want to mention one small thing about it, if I can quickly pull up my GitHub page here. So here's a GitHub page for Software Saturdays. It will have the demos for every week right there. You can see in every folder, demo 1 through 5, and then a README. You can ignore that file if you want here. The important thing, if you want older lessons, if you're familiar with the GitHub, they're in a different branch. If you're not, the master branch, as you can see over here, will be the files for the current week. So for the certain lessons, for example, week 2 or week 3 or week 1. If you want a slightly older week, click on the little drop-down menu in the upper part of this little blue box, and you can choose which lesson you want. So again, master will always be the current week, and lesson 1 will be, for example, lesson 1's file. So you can click here, and here's all the files from last week. And then obviously that will be increased with hopefully up to 5 or 6 branches as we get to the end of the semester. So let me go back to my PowerPoints. And again, that GitHub is linked to the slideshow on Slack as well, if you want to go there. All right, JavaScript time. So what is JavaScript? JavaScript is a high-level programming language used to create dynamic web pages. So if you guys remember from last time, we made an HTML page, but it was kind of boring. We didn't really do a whole lot. We could like make it look pretty with some CSS. We could like lay out text elements like in paragraph tags or heading tags. But besides that, it didn't really do anything. But what we can do is use JavaScript to actually modify these pages and make them more interactive. And as you can see the second bullet point there, JavaScript can be used in an HTML page. That's why it's one of the most is the most popular programming language on the web. Almost every website you're going to see will use JavaScript somewhere. It's guaranteed. So it's very important that you guys get familiar with it. Yeah. And second, if you're familiar with either Python or C, or even a language similar to one of those two, JavaScript has many similarities to those two languages, and we'll go over that in more detail, but basically it has like the syntax of like a C, so brackets and like the loops and the semicolons, all that kind of come from C, but like it also has the variables from Python. So if you're familiar with Python, any variable can be any data type. There's no concept of types in Python. Oh, in JavaScript too as well, my bad. So let's cover some basic JavaScript syntax. The first two things here are defining a variable. Where, as I said before, there are no data types in JavaScript, there are ways to define variables in JavaScript. The two ways there are to define a variable is with var, V-A-R, and let, L-E-T. And they both will define a basic JavaScript variable. So what's the difference between let and var then? Well, we'll go over that in a little bit more in about 3 or 4 slides, but really there's a lot of differences between the two of them. We will be using let, and I'll explain why in a little bit later on. Next is function. This describes a sort of a function, so it's kind of like the word def in Python, or kind of like just like the like a function header in C or Java. And again, it starts the function off. So we can use that to define any number of user-made functions that are useful for obviously whatever we might need in the future. And finally, the last thing is the word document. This is actually like a pre-made variable that's defined automatically by the web browser that refers to the HTML web page. So if you want to like reference the page, like change stuff from the page, we'll go over that towards the end. We can use the word document to refer to that page. Some more final stuff. This is again very C or Python-like, so if you're familiar with either of those two languages, this will probably be very familiar. If, else, for, and while define if statements and else statements, a for loop, and a while loop. If you've never programmed before, this might be a little bit unfamiliar to you, but if you had any experience with any kind of language, no matter what kind of language it is, these terminologies probably are familiar. They probably seem similar to what you guys have done before. All right, and then the last couple of things is math operators. Again, this is very Python-like and Java-like or C-like, so if you're familiar with those languages, this should seem pretty easy. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, modulus, and exponents. Now, the first four are pretty self-explanatory. I think a lot of people know what addition and subtraction and multiply and divide do. And exponents are, a little bit out there, but they're pretty commonly used. Does anyone want to say what modulus does? You can put in the chat if you have an idea. What does the mod operator do? I see one. Yes, it does the remainders. Perfect. Thank you. Right. So it displays the remainders of division. It is not commenting. No, it's not like commenting. I saw that one response there. It does remainder. So if I do, for example, like 10 mod 3, 10 is divided into 3 times, right? 9. But there's 1 left over. So the remainder is 1. Therefore, the mod is the remainder. So 10 mod 3 is 1. Because the remainder of 10 divided by 3 is 1. This has a lot of use cases in programming. Some of the most common ones is modding by 2 to see if a number is even or odd. Or you can like mod a number by 10. And that will get you the last digit of that number. So there's a lot of use cases. We won't cover it too much, but do know it is there if you need to do something with remainders and division. And then finally, there's some JavaScript comparison operators. So they're very similar to, again, most programming languages, less than or equal to, greater than, or greater than or equal to. And then finally, equal to and not equal to. Some differences are the JavaScript has 2 more, strict equal to and strict not equal to. These are defined differently because they have either 3 equal signs, like the case of strict equal to, or in the case of not equal to, 2 equal signs after the exclamation point. Again, we'll go over these kind of quirks after we kind of cover the basic syntax, but just be aware that JavaScript does have a strict equal to and a strict not equal to that you will have to be careful about when using JavaScript code. All right, and then last thing I want to cover before we jump into our very first demo is how do we add JavaScript to an HTML file. To add JavaScript to an HTML file, we can use what's called a script tag. It's kind of like a normal HTML tag. Use the same kind of like angle bracket notation we used last week. The only difference is this time the stuff inside of the tag is not printed to the screen. So it's kind of like that div tag. If you guys remember that div tag we kind of covered last week, where it's kind of like it's there in the code, but you can't see it. It won't be visible to the end user. So the way you can use it is you put the script tag, like you see in that second bullet point there, and in the very first, like in the opening tag for script, you put a space, src equals, in quotes, the name of your script file. Does anyone want to guess what src stands for? It's a very commonly used in programming all over the world. Source. Yes, good job. It stands for source. It basically defines the source code for a script or a programming file or something like that. All right, it's time for demo 1, some basic JavaScript. So let me pull up my Visual Studio Code here and open up my demo 1. So I'll open up these files here. Actually, I'm going to minimize this to make it easier for me. And I'm going to move this over here. So let's look at the HTML file first. So this HTML file looks pretty normal. It looks kind of like the way we did last week. We have our doc type HTML, our HTML tag, the head tag, the body tag. But there's a few things I want to walk over here. The head tag. So if you guys remember from last week, I mentioned that the head tag will have a lot of stuff in there that we will give you. You won't have to know exactly what it does. And this is an example, but the first week will probably tell you what to put. And you can look into why we need these later on. But for right now, just you can put them in there and it won't, it'll make your code work better. So there's a comment here, a HTML comment in green. And this is telling you that don't worry about it. It has to be there to make the web page look better. The first thing we see here is, again, these 2 tags is define stuff for the web browser, like the character encoding and the size of the web page. And then finally, we have a title tag, kind of like last week. And then the link to our CSS file, again, same as last week. In the body tag, we have a script tag over here. This loads in our script. So again, you can see it's a script space src equals, and then quotation marks demo1.js, and then a closing script tag. And then we have some text that will display on the screen. So if you guys want to remember from last time, to launch this, what you're going to do is open up a file explorer, go to your file and double click the demo1.html, and it should launch in a web browser. So as you can see here, the text says the page will not change. Please look at your web browser console to view the results of the code. Your web browser console is kind of like a debugging tool, or kind of like a specialized tool to help advanced users like yourselves inspect and kind of like look through the code and how the website works, to maybe debug and fix some errors in their code, or like just kind of figure out like how things look, or like find amazing stuff. Every web browser has a console. Most modern ones have a console. So like Edge, Chrome, Firefox, they all have a console you can access. And the way to get to most consoles is to right-click anywhere on the page with your mouse and look at inspect elements. On Firefox, it's mapped to the Alt-Q button here, or F12, but on Chrome, it can be something else. I'm not sure exactly the keystroke is there. So you can click on inspect element. Now, I'm going to click on that and fix mine because it messed up. There you go. And you'll see it pops up on the bottom here. It might be for you on the right or the left. It depends upon where your default placement is. But I like mine on the bottom, so I'm going to put mine on the bottom. This is going to help you with a whole bunch of cool tabs. We won't cover most of these tags. The only one we're going to really look at is the one here, the second one in Firefox. In Chrome, I think it's also the second one, called console. The console tag is going to have the output of our code. So let's go back to our code, look what our code does. All right, so here's a commented file giving you in detail all of the basic stuff we practiced from last week. Or again, last slide, my bad, week, whoops. The first line here defines a basic variable var, using the word var. And this is to show you that we can use var to define a basic variable that again can store any data type. On line 4, we also define a new variable, this one with the word let. This is to show you that the var versus let give you the same variable, but the way they work is very different and can cause some problem if you use the wrong one. We then print them out to the screen. In JavaScript, there is no idea of printing. There's only the idea of what's called logging. So console.log will kind of like print the results of whatever's in between the parentheses to the browser console. This is mostly used for debugging. You should not be using console.log for like user input or output. It's only there for basically debugging or like error messages or like warnings and stuff like that a developer or an advanced user might want, not the average end user. We will go over towards the end how to actually print out your JavaScript stuff to a website. Next, we have some basic math stuff. So again, we're going to use let from here on out. So I'm going to always use let when I'm making a new variable. And I just have a whole bunch of math going through here. Let's take about a couple minutes. How about everyone walk through what the math block does on lines 12 through 18? What do we think is going to print out on line 19? So kind of walk through the math. It's all very basic stuff, so kind of think through it, keep track of it, and if you think you have an answer, put it in the chat. I saw one person get it right. Okay, I'm seeing anyone else coming in. Yes, so it's actually 27, so some more people coming in. Perfect, 27. And you can walk through it if you don't believe it and prove it for yourself. But the math is very simple. Like again, the only tricky one here is probably going to be the mod operator or the exponent operator you can see below that one. Just remember, mod means that it takes whatever is on the left-hand side, divides it by whatever on the right-hand side, and gives you the remainder. So if you want to walk through it, you can totally do that and prove it to yourself that math does what it's supposed to do. Then we print it out to the console, and then we print out a little breaker to make, just to break it up, make it look nicer when you look at the code results. And then we demonstrate a basic if-else. So here's an if statement with an else condition. Again, if you've used another programming language, it's look pretty familiar. We either print the word true or false. And then finally, we do a basic while loop. While loops and for loops, again, very similar to C. So we just print out the number that's stored in I, which is, I believe, 0 through 3. So if we go to our web browser console, let me pull it up here, and we look at our console tab, again, in the right click, inspect elements, or F12 if you're on Firefox. On Chrome, it might be different. 10, that's the result of our first variable, was stored in the let, the second variable we made. And then we have 27, we have that false condition, and then 0 through 4 that while loop. So again, this is very similar to most other programming languages. So if you're familiar with any other language, JavaScript is not too hard to pick up. All right, are there any questions so far about the demo 1, which is a basic JavaScript? I'll pull up my code here. You can follow along here. And don't forget the code is in the GitHub if you want to follow along there as well. Demo 1 folder. Cool. So let me close out some demo files. All right. Now, as I kept mentioning and hinting at this entire lecture, never use var, let versus var. So while both do exist inside the JavaScript standard, let is newer. It was created in, I believe, the mid 2010s, whereas var was first introduced way back in the 90s when JavaScript was first created. So it's been around for only a couple of years, but let has a lot of safety precautions that var does not have that might screw up your code or cause errors or introduce bugs you didn't realize would be bugs until much later. From now on, we will always be using let. You guys see that before in the code because of these safety precautions. So if you're feeling a little bit more advanced, these safety precautions include stuff like var automatically globally scopes every variable, no matter where it's defined, whereas let is only locally scoped. And var also what's called hoists up values, meaning you can use the variable before it's defined, which can cause obviously errors, whereas let you can only use a variable once it's defined. If you don't know what those words mean, don't worry about it. Just always use let when making variables. Never, ever use var. Tutorials you read online might use var, but just ignore those. All right, and the last thing, types of equal to. So if you remember from that slide a couple slides ago, I mentioned strict equal to versus equals to. This is one of those quirks of JavaScript that is very hard to get used to if you're not familiar with it. But once you get familiar with it, it's pretty simple. Using two equal signs, like the standard equals to in most languages, allows JavaScript to convert the type before comparing. Whereas using three equal signs will not allow any conversions before comparing. So I have a link here to an example of the difference between the two of them. I won't go into it now, but if I look at it in a little bit, you totally can. It's an example of this. So some bad things can happen if you're not careful. On the bottom, I have some examples of some random comparisons that you might come across. For example, the first one, the string 1 and the number 1, if you use two equal signs, JavaScript will convert the string to a number and then compare them, giving you true. Whereas if you use three equal signs, it will compare them as a string to a number, and it just comes out to be false. Now, there are times where you might want the behavior of one or the other, so it's very important to know what they do and what your code is supposed to do, so that if it comes up that you want to do one thing or the other, you can choose the proper signage for your equality checker. Another example, the number 1, the integer 1, if you use two equal signs, is equal to true. which is kind of similar to C, but it might not be similar to other languages or other things you might want to do, like comparing a Boolean to a Boolean. If you however use three equal signs, like one triple equals true, this becomes false because the Boolean true is not the same as the integer number 1. So again, it's all about knowing what your code is supposed to do and knowing what the symbols mean. And if you have any bugs, take a look at your equal signs. It's because you might be using the wrong one by accident. All right, were there any questions about let versus var and strict equal to versus regular equal to? Okay, I don't see any in the panelist chat. So, again, if you have any questions, you can put them in Slack or wait for your breakout rooms towards the end to answer them there. All right, now let's cover some function stuff. Functions in JavaScript work very similar to functions in every other programming language. They can have parameters and they can return results. You don't need parameters and you don't need return values, but they can be useful depending upon the situation. Parameters can change the result of your program, and return values can return data from the function. Let's go to demo 2 really quick. Go to my demo 2 folder. All right, so HTML file, again, looks very similar to last time. I just changed the CSS file here and the JavaScript file here in the script tag, and then the link tag over here. Almost everything else is like a word-for-word copy. All right, our CSS file just has some basic formatting stuff in there. We saw last time as well. And then here is the JavaScript file. So again, it's commented to make it easy to see. This first function here, so it's function, name, and then parentheses, and then it curly braces around everything, has a function with no return values and no parameters. So all this function does is it logs this function has no return, no parameters, just to show you can have a function with neither one. You then, second function here on line 6 has a return value. Return values can be whatever you want. Strings, numbers, booleans, etc., etc. So if you feel like you want a different kind of return value, you can do whatever you want. In this example, I chose a string, so our function here returns a string. This function has a return value. And then lastly, you can have a parameters. You can see here on line 11. Once again, the parameters can be whatever they want. Strings, integer numbers, booleans, etc., etc. You can also have as many parameters as you want. My example here has 2 parameters, but you can choose between 0, if you have none, 1, 2, 3, 4, 25, 17, as many as you want. But just be in mind that you do have to use all of them. So don't put extra because you can. So kind of figure out what your function wants to do before you write it. This one, what it does, it takes 2 numbers and adds them together. So it returns a value of param1 plus param2. To call a function, you put the name of the function, an open and close parenthesis, and then a semicolon. Again, this is very similar to other languages, so it might look pretty familiar. And then you can also call, if you want to call it with the return value, you set a variable, so let test return in this case equals no params. Again, kind of calling it like we did on the line before it. One person says this is like a merge of C and Python. Yes, it is very similar to both those languages. It was actually inspired by both those languages. So if you're familiar with one or both, this will hopefully seem very familiar to you. Then we just log the results in this console.log statement. And then finally, we try a function with a return value and 2 parameters. So we store it in the variable let test return like we did before, we made up here. And we say that it's equal to the result of altogether, which is this function we defined over here, 1 and 2, and we log that right there. So if we open up our File Explorer, we go to our demo 2, and then open demo2.html, and we can close the demo1 here. And again, open up our console. We will see that it prints out what we expected. The function has no returns or parameters. This function has a return value, and then the number 3, which is 1 plus 2. So again, this should seem pretty familiar if you've used programming before. If you haven't, I hope these slides have enough info for you to kind of like get the grasp of the programming in JavaScript. Okay, let me pull up my code. Was there any questions about demo 2? All right, I don't see any. Perfect, let's move on. All right, time for our checkpoints. So I've put a lot of info at you guys in the past couple of minutes. So what we're gonna do now is, excuse me, my bad. I want everyone to try to write a FizzBuzz program in in an HTML file and with some CSS and with some JavaScript that in your browser console will do the following. Write a function that prints the numbers from 1 to 100. For multiples of 3, print fizz instead of the number, and for multiples of 5, print buzz instead of the number. For numbers that are multiples of both 3 and 5, print fizz buzz. This is a very popular programming question that you might see in interviews or other practice websites. So give it a shot. Again, if you want to look at how to add JavaScript to your HTML page, look at demos 1 or 2 in the GitHub on this linked on the slides. Give it a shot. If you have any questions, put them in the chat, and I will hopefully get them answered as soon as I can see them. We'll take about 10 minutes. It's currently about 4:07 Eastern. So let's say at 4:17 or so, we'll come back and move on. All right. Time for a little bit more advanced stuff. The stuff we're going to cover now is going to be very important for ReactJS. So I'm not going to cover it in too much detail here. We will cover the next couple of topics in much more detail in a little bit, probably in week 4. So if you don't fully understand it, don't worry. We will have much more info about it in week 4. JavaScript arrays. Arrays are in every language. They are a way to combine a list of multiple data values. So you can have all kinds of variables or a quantity of data types, any kind of data types, as a way to basically group stuff together in an easy to use and transfer format. So if you've ever programmed before, you have definitely come across arrays before. Every basic programming course covers arrays. Every tutorial covers arrays because they're so important. And in JavaScript, they work just like every other language's arrays. They use you surround your array in square brackets, and you separate each element of your array with a comma. I'll show you an example of that in our demo number 3. Arrays can also hold any type and quantity of data, like I mentioned before. So if you want to hold a string, a number, and then another string after it, totally. You can put between 0 and infinite number of values in your array as well. It's whatever you want it to do. Arrays are also what's called zero indexed. Zero indexed means that the array, the first element of the array is what's called index 0. If you programmed in another language like C, Python, Java, etc., this is basically the way it works over there. If you've programmed in MATLAB, it's also a very common language. This is not how it works in MATLAB. MATLAB uses what's called one index or first indexed, meaning the first element is the first index. While that is more intuitive for us humans to look at it, number 1 should be number 1, it's not intuitive from a computer, since computers count from the number 0. So because of that, the first element, the first thing you're storing is the 0 index. So the second thing you store is index 1, the third thing is index 2, so on and so on. And then demo 3 time. All right, let me launch our demo 3. I won't go over the HTML and CSS because they are the same as they were last time. I'll look at demo 3 here. Here is a basic JavaScript array. So as I mentioned, you store it in a variable. So here let array, and then we have these 2 square brackets. These define the outline or the actual around the array. So we have 2 square brackets here, and all the data we want to store in this array is put in between it, where you put a comma in between each part or each element is called of the array. So here we're storing the integer 1, the integer 4, the boolean true, the string test, and the double -4, or the float -4.5. We then print out the array, as you can see here on line 4 and 5, again using console.log. This will also work for arrays. Then a few more things you want to be careful of, or more useful functions you might want to use, are array.length. Array.length will give you the length, obviously, of the array, meaning how many elements are in your array. So for example, this array here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements. So the array.length will be 5. Now it's important to remember that the array.length is going to be 1 higher than the last index. And that's because the 5th element, which is this -4.5, is the length of the array, but it is also the 4th index because we start counting at 0. So it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's important to remember that arrays are 0 indexed. Okay, now we print out the array length and we print out the index of some random indices from the array. To access an element of the array, you put the variable name like you did up here and over here, and then in square brackets around it here, you put the actual element number you want. So in this example, the element number is 3, and so the 3rd element is 0, 1, 2, 3. It is a string test. And then we also print out the index at 0. And again, the index at 0 is the very first element, so it's the 1. And then this still line here is for demo 4, because demo 3 and demo 4 are combined because they're kind of similar. So I won't go over that below the stuff below it until after demo 4. So let's go to our web browser, open this bad boy up, and launch demo 3. Oh, it opened up the wrong window, my bad. Let's drag you over to the right window. All right, there we go. So again, we won't see anything here. So go to our console and go to our console tab. Again, ignore stuff below it. Not important for now. We'll cover that in a second. This prints out the array. So the array looks exactly the same as it did before. The length is 5. The value in the 3rd index is test, right? Remember, it's index 0, 1, 2, and 3 right there. And then we have the number 1, which comes from the 0th index at the top. Are there any questions about arrays so far? Let me minimize this. Okay. And again, if you have a question, please copy it to both the attendees and participants, attendees and panelists, because I unfortunately cannot see both of them for some reason. I don't know why, unfortunately. Okay. This is the last, I would say one of the last new things we're going to cover this week. My bad. JavaScript objects. We will cover JavaScript objects in much more detail again on week, I believe it's 4 and 5. But I want to go over it briefly because you might come across it and you might want to learn about it more. It's called, so JavaScript objects are stored what's called JSON. JSON is JavaScript object notation. You probably have seen, if you program like what's called an API, you might have seen JSON pop up at some point. It stands for JavaScript object notation, and it is one of the standardized formats on the web to transfer data between computers. So JSON, again, you can see here, we will use it later on. We call what's called an API, or an application programming interface. And it's a way to transfer data between computers. It's in a format that's hard for computers to see. Well, it's hard for us to decipher sometimes, but it's really easy for a computer to understand. Han, I think your answer went to the wrong person there. Again, I'm really sorry this chat is separated like that. We will find a better solution for it, hopefully soon. Yeah, so you can kind of imagine like a JavaScript object, like a fancy array, where like you can store data in this array and then reference it with like what's called like an index, like a key. So JavaScript objects use what are called key value pairs. And the key is like a label, like a name for referencing some data. And then the object can be any data type or even a function. And you can even store another object in an object value. So that sounds like a lot of confusing stuff, but really it's just, if you use like a dictionary in Python or a hash map in like Java, it's very similar to like those. So let's kind of look at an example here. Demo 4, which is in the same folder as Demo 3 because they're kind of related, creates a basic object. So here is a random old basic object. So again, we use let object to define a variable called object, and using these curly braces, this time is curly braces, we define an object. And this object has a whole bunch of what are called keys and a whole bunch of what are called data values. On the left of this colon here is the key, and on the right is the data value. And each line has a comma. So we have school, we have location, we have participants, and we have is online. And each of these keys has a specific result, a specific data value with it. So school is Purdue, location is WebEx, participants is 50, and is online is true, which kind of describes software studies essentially for us this semester. So what you can do is you can actually access stuff inside of an array, inside of an object, my bad. We can print out the whole thing, kind of like an array or variable, again, console.log. But if you want to access a very specific element of the array, or of the object, I keep saying array, my bad, of the object, we can use console.log object, and then we can use the school in the brackets, in parentheses, in quotes, to access the school key of the object. So you can imagine it's like an array, like a fancy array, right? So you can use this, but instead of putting a number in between the square brackets like you did for an array, you put in quotes the actual, the name of what's called the key, or the label for the data you wanted to retrieve. Let's get school. You can also use what's called dot notation. This is called bracket notation, and this is called dot notation. So dot notation, you can use object dot and then the name of the key name or the label name, we want to call it, in this case school. And as you see, they both refer to Purdue, the string Purdue as defined on line 3. So you can again use either this bracket notation or this dot notation. I personally, moving forward, will be using dot notation, the second one here on line 15 and 16. But you are free to use whatever you want, whatever you feel more comfortable with. The last thing we can do is you can change stuff. So again, using the dot notation, we can say that the object.location will be changed from WebEx to online. Then we'll log it to show you that the thing actually changed. Are there any questions about the code so far? Okay, now let's look at the web browser. Again, it's the same file as demo 3. So below this, this dashed line is where the code for demo 4 lives. As you can see, it prints out the object, kind of like we did before. So here's the object and all of the fields and the values and all that stuff. Here is the label school stored in both the using bracket and dot notation. So you can use it in both ways. It'll give you the same result. And then you can see here we reassigned the location from WebEx to online and printed out the word online here. Again, we'll cover this in the future. Don't worry about it too much right now. Okay. That is actually all the syntax we're going to cover for JavaScript. There's some more stuff we have to cover, but that won't be it won't be new JavaScript. It'll be adding it to HTML now. So before we move on, let's take a checkpoint 4 or checkpoint 2. Just take a brief moment, again using your text editor, create a JavaScript array and object and print them to the console. So demos 3 and 4 are kind of exactly what you want you to do. Just kind of practice the idea of writing and reading from an array and from an object. So someone asks, can you only print to the console by opening an HTML file that links to the JavaScript file? Technically, no. There are ways that you can reference JavaScript without having to use HTML. However, because we're making a web dev course that's all about web design, I'm going to strongly encourage you to practice it with this in mind. There are fancier tools you can use that'll just run the JavaScript by itself, but I recommend, just because to practice the idea of script tagging and combining files together, you use HTML files to reference JavaScript files. And another person asks, does JavaScript have the thing like C where a single, like apostrophes are used to indicate characters and double quotes are used for strings, or is it both ways okay? I'm like 75% sure that both ways are okay. I've used both and I'm pretty sure they work, but I will double check that in 1 second for you. Now it's time for what I consider to be the fun stuff. You might disagree on this one, but so far, we've been dealing with like making like stuff happen in the browser console, like doing backend stuff. Nothing super fun for the user, right? Well, that's about to change. Now we can learn how to modify HTML and CSS with JavaScript. Now, most web pages, this is what you're going to want to do, because obviously you want the page to react in something that the user did. But how do we do that exactly? So that document I mentioned earlier, the Word document, is defined by your web browser and refers to your HTML web page. So the entire HTML code is exposed to your JavaScript file with the Word document. It's kind of like a list of all the tags and such in your file. You can actually use class and ID fields that we learned about last week with CSS to find and change HTML and CSS elements. So that's with CSS there as well. So remember, as a reminder, classes. You can have as many classes as you want in a file, and you can have multiple HTML tags that are of a certain class. However, with an ID, while you can have multiple IDs in an HTML file, you can only have one HTML tag per ID name. And you'll see why we make this distinction in a second as well. So if you're unfamiliar with classes versus IDs, on Slack, I would revisit the slides for lesson 1, specifically on CSS grouping, because that's kind of where this came up. So here are some functions. I do not expect anyone to remember these, so just like know that they exist and you can look at them up if you need to later. But you can use what's called these get elements to find HTML tags, and then these dot inner or dot styles to actually change specific elements of an HTML page. So the first one, get element by ID. This finds and returns. So again, it's gonna have you're gonna have to it has a return value associated with it, a HTML element with that has a certain ID you give it in the parameters. And then while document.get elements by class name gets an array of every element with a certain class name. So again, because IDs are only a single, like you can only have one tag per ID, the tag is going to be it'll only return one value, whereas class name can return an array of values because there can be multiple elements with that class name. And then once you have an element, you can change the inner HTML with .inner HTML, as you can see here, or change the CSS style with dot style. Again, I do not expect you to remember this. I will have this pulled up after we cover this so you can review it a bit more. And these are also very common, and you'll find them on tutorials everywhere if you want to go off of that. And then finally, the last thing about making JavaScript more interactive. You remember that button click that button we talked about last week? It didn't really do a whole lot, but this time we can add what's called an on-click function to the HTML button, and the button will run some JavaScript when it is clicked. So the normal way to do that is button, then on-click, and then in quotes, the name of your JavaScript function, and then obviously you follow the regular HTML syntax here. So, demo time. Here we go, demo 5. Let me minimize some of these tabs here. HTML, okay. So this file looks pretty regular, pretty normal if you ask me. Now this body tag has, the only important thing is these H1, H2 tags, these heading tags, have a class. The class name is heading. Again, we can have multiple classes with the same, multiple elements with the same class name. We next have a paragraph tag with the ID of please change. As a reminder, you can only have one ID type per tag or per HTML file. So we just have some random, text here, and then we have a button, and this button on click will run this JavaScript function called change page. We also have a script tag, again, just to link our JavaScript file to our HTML page, like normal. So this again looks like a pretty standard HTML file. We do have some changes here though. So in the CSS file, I've added a heading, so we make the heading red, and the background color of our p tag is this really weird light green color. You can kind of, if I hover over, you can kind of see it. We are going to change these with good old JavaScript. So I'll go over to my demo5.js file, and here is the function that'll run when you click the button. Function change page. That's the same functionality written in the on click you can see right there. So the first thing we do, we change some HTML text. So we get a variable, let p tag, again make a new variable, and storing the return of this document.get element by ID. Remember, it returns an element, so we have to store it inside of some variable to keep it. So we say document.get element by ID, and then the ID name is please change. That is the ID of the paragraph tag we mentioned earlier. The next thing we do is using that element.inner HTML, we replace the word element with that p tag because the element's name is p tag. And that p tag's inner HTML, so the actual text in between the tags is changed into this page was changed. As a reminder, here's the original p tag right here. So basically everything between the opening and closing tag, all of this is going to get replaced with whatever is after the equal sign. In this case, the string, this page was changed. This is a bit of an advanced feature, but if you want, you can actually put HTML tags inside of this string, and it will run it as regular HTML. But we won't cover that until week 4. The last thing we'll go over is changing CSS style. So again, we make a new variable, let h tags, and store the array that is returned from this document.getElementsByClassName. So the class name here is heading. Again, that's the class name for both the h1 and the h2 tags, and we store it in the array called h tags. We then have a basic for loop that we have a basic JavaScript for loop here that basically just goes through the array. So this is kind of like the way you would format like a C or like a JavaScript for loop. We have an incremental variable I equal to 0, I less than the length of the array, h tag, and then we increase I after every count. If you're not familiar with the JavaScript syntax or like for loops, please come to office hours. We will help you figure out how to learn programming. What we then do is we say for the element in the array at I, this is again a little bit complicated, so if you need help with that, ask in your breakout rooms. We change the style, we change the color of the color of it to blue. The color before was red, remember? So we're making it blue in this case. So let's run our file and see what happens. So we go to our File Explorer, run demo5.html, and open up in the wrong folder. My bad. And all right, here we go. Here is the file. So again, the heading 1 and heading 2 tag are nice bright red. The background of the P tag is this nice weird light green color. You know, a button that says click me. So if we click this button, the text color should change to blue, and this P tag should change into the text should change to something else. So click it. Ta-da! We now have a way to modify HTML and CSS with JavaScript. So the text color changed to blue like we wanted it to, and the P tag changed from nothing to this nice green color. Is it spazzing out? It's just me. It might just be WebEx kind of weirdly encoding it, my bad. So that is how to basically modify code or modify an HTML page with JavaScript and CSS. Are there any questions about that so far? Again, here are the important functions and methods you might want to remember when it comes to HTML and JavaScript editing. Okay, I do not see any questions. All right, so there is a lot more to JavaScript. We only went over the basics. There are a lot more things you can learn about, including like lambdas, async functions, get requests, parameters, a whole bunch more. We won't cover a lot of these, but you can learn about them if you want. And again, this W3 Schools link is a great resource for help if you do need it. Time for breakout rooms. So give me a couple minutes to set up breakout rooms and we'll go into them. And you should get some help on checkpoint 1 or 2 or soon to be announced checkpoint 3, or just any other questions about anything in JavaScript you might have so far. So before we move into that, here's the checkpoints. That fizzbuzz function we wrote earlier. See if you can print out the numbers from the console instead of the console to the HTML page. And if you're feeling kind of advanced, maybe find a way to change the style of multiples of 3 and 5. So again, if you're not sure how to do this, ask your mentor in the breakout room. It'll either be me or Mitchell, or in the Slack. We'll both get in the Slack as well. And then some last wrap-up information. Thank you for listening. If you have any feedback, please fill out the form you see here. It's also the last slide of the Google Docs slide if you have the Slack. This is an anonymous feedback form. We do look at these forms and it helps us figure out what's going wrong and what's going right. So please tell us if something is not working out. And then lastly, we do have review hours. So ask questions in the breakout room or review hours every Thursday between 6 and 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. Someone will always be there. They'll put the link out if you haven't seen the link this week in the Slack. And come if you have questions about programming, JavaScript, HTML, web stuff, whatever it may be.